9. The form of government is not nearly so important as its quality. Justice and a lack of arbitrariness, for instance, are two characteristics of a government that are most important to the welfare and happiness of a people. They are as likely to be found, or more accurately, as little likely to be found under any one form of government as another. Rampant interference with personal lives is the most obnoxious characteristic of any government, and that is found just as readily under elected officials as under hereditary monarchs. In fact, as the Greeks pointed out, as has been well known to careful students of history ever since, and as the founding fathers of our own republic were well aware, when an elected government succeeds in attracting and maintaining an overwhelming majority behind it for any length of time, its mob instincts make it the most tyrannical of all forms of social organization. Now, incidentally, a tragic result of the emphasis placed by historians and statesmen on the form of the American government has been the emulation by newly independent Asiatic nations of the wrong thing in our American system. These Asiatics, some cases people in Africa, admiring the tremendous success of the United States, observing the unprecedented prosperity, freedom, and opportunities for happiness on the part of its people, looking up to the United States as the example to be followed, nation after nation in other parts of the world, but especially in Asia, has copied the American government for itself. Its budding political scientists have felt that this must be the key to national success and greatness, as it clearly would have been if they had copied the right thing, the very thing that had made America great. But what these new nations have taken for themselves are carbon copies of the American government at the time their own governments were being established. In far too many cases, this has been since the New Deal had completely stultified the original virtues of the American government. The Philippines, for instance, in 1948, took over every form of welfarism and every stifling regulation and suppression of private enterprise and substitute, therefore, which Roosevelt's New Dealers had been able to impose on us even with a war to help them. The results were and still are pathetic, simply because the Filipinos had been led to believe that it was the form of the American government which counted. But actually it had been the small amount, the small quantity of government in America throughout its centuries of mushrooming productivity, not the form of that government, which had been the vital factor of success. The Filipinos and others like them took over instead the excesses of a government which excesses were already in a fair way to start the decline of America itself. Now, I use the Philippines for illustration for 2 or 3 reasons. What I've said applies in so many places, and a couple of those reasons are highlighted by an experience I had, which could be called the perfect squelch. I still laugh at it. The first time I'd ever been in the Philippines, this is 1949, and I only had 3 days, and I wanted to see all I could. Thursday and Friday, I got a driver. I did all I could sightseeing. And Saturday, I was scheduled to leave that night, Saturday night. I knew, I'd been told, that before I'd be able to board my plane, I would have to have a certificate from the Filipino government showing that I did not owe them any income tax. So, Saturday morning, I went down to get that out of the way. And I found out from the Manila Hotel, which at that time was flying on one wing, some of you may remember. One whole wing of it was destroyed during the war, and they hadn't been able to rebuild it yet. They did a good job with half of a hotel, better than the South Koreans were able to do with half of an economy or half of a country. But anyway, I found out from a hotel what building to go to, and I went down there and set out to get this paper. Well, ladies and gentlemen, at 3 o'clock that afternoon, I was still trying to get it. There were a couple of hundred Filipinos milling around. There were several offices and windows and people in them and with desks and all. But I just wasn't getting anywhere. Everywhere I went, I was thrown somewhere else, or passed the buck, or told to go somewhere else, and so forth. And being a poor country boy and rather ignorant about these matters, it took me till 3 o'clock that afternoon to realize that I just wasn't going to get any such certificate until I paid somebody some money. So then I called a Filipino over, and I don't think it made the slightest difference which one of the 200 I called, the biggest loafing bum there or the most important official. It made no difference. I called one of them over and gave him a $5 bill. And I said, I need this certificate. You can do anything about it? And he said, sure. Well, he probably gave $3 to somebody and kept $2 for himself, or vice versa. I had my certificate in 5 minutes. So I took my certificate then, I went back to the hotel, and I was mad. So I went up to the Pan American counter, and a very tall, nice-looking young Filipino behind there, very well-groomed, Pan American uniform, really looked nice, clean-cut, very friendly and nice, and spoke perfect English. So I had to take out steam on somebody. My wife wasn't present. I couldn't use her for this purpose. And so I took out after him. And I said, it just doesn't make sense. I probably put a little profanity in it. I said, I'm only here 3 days. I'm traveling as a tourist on my own money that I've saved. I wanted to see all of the Philippine islands that I could in just 3 days. And I said, I couldn't possibly owe the Philippine government any income tax. I haven't done any business here of any kind. I haven't even bought anything except what I've eaten or drank. And there's no way I could at all owe them any income tax. And here I've had to waste my whole last day in Manila over this. It just doesn't make sense. It's ridiculous. He said, yes, sir. I agree with you completely, sir. You're absolutely right. As a matter of fact, that is one regulation of the United States government that I don't think we should have adopted when we went into the government business for ourselves. That was the absolute truth. They had just copied it verbatim from our government. And I found out from some of my French friends and English friends later that they'd had plenty of trouble with it as a regulation of our government. It's been softened since and modified and straightened out. But this is what I'm talking about. These different governments just took over right from us verbatim right down the line, whatever regulations Roosevelt and his crowd and the bureaucrats had brought in. The Filipinos went into the government business for themselves, as this man, this Pan American guy put it, of course, as you know, in 1948, when we forced independence on them, following the horrible European pattern of England and the French governments and so forth. The worst thing in the world could happen to them, and they were perfectly happy, and their economy was well handled and coming along. In fact, it was tragic for many reasons. America had reason to be very proud up to that point of what it had done in the Philippines. The British were in India for generations, and they had almost no impact on the thinking of the ordinary Hindu or Muslim or Sikh in India whatsoever. Their dealings were all with the Rajas and the Maharajas and government, and they were aloof, and it didn't affect at all the people. It had nothing to do with bringing them to realize that they could do anything about their own lives, which they hadn't and didn't. In the Filipinos, the Americans had been there a little over a generation, and the impact of American ways and thinking had been terrific. Every Filipino you saw wanted to get a second-hand Chevrolet and make it a taxi, or start a garage to repair cars, or start a beer joint, they're great beer drinkers, or do something, and had a feeling that they could do something as individuals about their own lives. And of course, this was all destroyed by the fact that they took over so much government with no industrial momentum, none of the industrialization behind it that we had to carry it when we were given so much bureaucracy and government. Everything bogged down, and it was only a fairly short time, a few years before, again, the Filipinos were thinking that they could do nothing about their own lives. It all depended just on government handouts or what the government did or how well the government ran things. And it was a crime to have that as the denouement of what our own influence and effect had led up to. All right, let's go back to these basic principles of government, which it seems to me can be supported in the light of all human experience. Basic principles that we can lay out with confidence as being generalities that hold, that are true. Number 10, the last of them, and in my opinion, the most overlooked and also the most important of these basic generalizations concerning government is this. It's the one of which Thomas Jefferson expressed a part in his famous dictum that that government is best which governs least. But Jefferson was thinking of the extent of a government's power more than of the extensiveness of the government itself. So our point is somewhat different. Our 10th point is that neither the form of government nor its quality is as important as its quantity. A thoroughly foul government like that of Nero, which still did not reach its tentacles too far into the daily lives and doings of its subjects, was far better for the Roman Empire in the long run than the intentionally benevolent government of Diocletian or of Constantine, whose bureaucratic agents were everywhere. Let's dramatize this fact, or opinion if you prefer, by bringing it closer home. And ladies and gentlemen, your speaker would like to have it understood, but let's make it very personal. I want it understood that I'm not condoning dishonesty in the slightest degree. I'm merely trying to make a point by an illustration. And the point is this, that for America at its present size, with its present population, I had rather have for America, and I'm convinced that America would be better off with, a government of 300,000 officials and agents, every single one of them a thief, than a government of 3 million agents, with every single one of them an honest, honorable public servant. For the first group would only steal from the American economic and political system. The second group would be bound in time to destroy it. We've lived through an awful lot of thievery by politicians without suffering too much, with America growing and expanding all the time. We cannot live through too much more of the total bureaucratic controls that are mushrooming as they are. The increasing quantity of government in all nations has constituted the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. Now let's spotlight just one particular result of this tragic development, which has occurred in connection with man's age-old worry, war. That result is the frequency, the length, the extensiveness, the horrible destructiveness, and the totality of impact on the population of the wars of the 20th century. In the physical sciences, we are accustomed to using combination measurements such as foot-pounds, kilowatt-hours, or man-days, or acre-feet of water. Let's invent such a phrase for the measurement of war and call it the day number horror unit. This is just to get a unit of measurement. In this three-way calculation, we multiply the days of suffering by the number of people who suffer, by the depth of the suffering, to arrive at an appraisal. Then, having any such unit for discrete measurement, I believe you will find that pretty generally throughout history, despite other factors causing occasional exceptions, and very definitely throughout recent centuries, the day number horrors measure of any war has been proportional to the contemporary extensiveness of government. In fact, and specifically, it has been directly proportional to the product of the quantities of government in the nations involved at the time a war was fought. Also, you will find that it is the huge quantity of government which, more than anything else, makes these tremendously destructive wars not only possible, but unavoidable. One illustration should make this statement too clear for argument. Do you, and I don't mean you now, people in general, the French I'm talking about you, specific individuals in this room, fight the Russian people? Have any slightest desire for any reason to fight the Russian people? Well, do you think that if you put together this number of Russians in a room and find out that they have, or that anybody among the Russian people has the slightest desire to fight us, then why on earth is there any danger? Do you think there would be the slightest chance of the American people and the Russian people fighting each other, with millions to be killed on both sides if they ever do, and great parts of both countries to be utterly destroyed if they ever do? Do you think there would be the slightest chance of that if there were only 1/10 as much government in each country as now exists? Stop and think about it for a minute. It is not only that governments carry their peoples into horrible and utterly unnecessary wars, but it takes a very huge quantity of government to carry its people into the totalitarian struggle which war has now been made by this same quantity of government. Reduce all the governments of all the nations of the world to 1/3 of their present size. Not 1/3 of their power, no, not to do with the power of government, nor are we referring to their quality, but just reduce all the governments of the nations to 1/3 of their bureaucratic numbers, their extensiveness, their meddling in the lives of their subjects, and you would immediately accomplish two things. You would reduce the likelihood of war between hostile nations to at most 1/9 of its present probability, and the destructiveness of any wars that did take place in the same proportion. Ladies and gentlemen, the greatest enemy of man is and always has been government. And the larger, the more extensive that government, the greater the enemy. Now, clearly the United States, which throughout its early centuries was the greatest beneficiary from the scarcity of government that the world has ever known, should not only return to the right course for its own further growth in prosperity, freedom, and happiness, but it should set an example again for the whole world. In fact, the word Americanist with a small a should be made and become understood as the very antithesis of socialism and communism with a little c. For the communist, using the word now with a little c to denote a theoretician rather than a member of the conspiracy, the communist believes that a collectivist society should swallow up all individuals, make their lives and their energies completely subservient to the needs and the purposes of the collectivist state, and that any means are permissible to achieve this end. The true Americanist believes that the individual should retain the freedom to make his own bargain with life and the responsibility for the results of that bargain, and that means are as important as ends in the civilized social order which he desires. The same two words with initial capitals, communist and Americanist, should merely denote the aggressive fighters for these two mutually exclusive philosophies. But Americanism, ladies and gentlemen, as either a phrase or a force on the contemporary world scene, has been eroded into something negative and defeatist. It has come to represent merely a delaying action against the victorious march of its enemy, collectivism. The air is full of clarion calls to Americans to organize in order better to fight against socialism, communism, or some vanguard of the socialist forces. Every day the mail brings to my desk pleas for me to contribute money or effort or moral support or all three to some group which is battling to hold back some particular advance of collectivist stormtroops. Even those organizations or activities which bear a positive label are motivated by negative thinking. An association for the Bricker Amendment is in reality an association against the intervention of international socialist forces in the control of our domestic lives. Americanism has become primarily a denial of something else rather than an assertion of itself. And there are many of us who think that this should be true no longer. We think that Americanism should again come to mean and to be a positive, forward-looking philosophy, a design and example of social organization which boldly and confidently offers leadership along the one hard but sure road to a better world. It is not just in the United States, of course, that all the aggressiveness is on the side of the socialist communist allies. In the worldwide ideological struggle which divides mankind today, we conservatives fight always on the defensive. The very name by which we identify ourselves defines our objective. It is to conserve as much as we can out of all we have inherited that is worthwhile from the encroachments and destructiveness of this advancing collectivism. In America, we build no more icons to freedom. We merely try to fend off the iconoclast who would destroy those that we still have. Such has been the pattern during the whole first half of the 20th century. From the bright plateaus of individual freedom and individual responsibility, which man had precariously attained, there has been a steady falling back towards the dark valleys of dependence and serfdom. But this ignominious retreat has been just as true of Americans, the heirs of a strong new society, as of the tired residual legatees of an old and enfeebled European civilization. During this long and forced retreat, we have fought only a rearguard and sometimes delaying action. We have never been rallied to counterattack, to break through the enemy or rout him, and to climb again beyond our highest previous gains. And in the unending skirmishes, to hold as much as possible of the ground currently occupied, we have lost all sight of the higher tablelands of freedom which once were our recognized goals. I, for one, and many others like me, are no longer willing to consider only when to retreat and how far. There is a braver and a wiser course. If we, heirs of all the ages, are to find a turning point in this rapid and sometimes stampeding descent, in which we are abandoning instead of improving our inheritance, if the last half of the 20th century is to see the curve that measures individual dignity turn upward, if the men who really wish to be free and self-reliant are to begin climbing back up the mountainside, then the goal must be known, and the purpose of aggressive offense must replace defensive defeatism as the banner under which we march. It is fatal to be merely against losing ground, for then there is no way to go but back. It only takes a moment to realize that. Napoleon pointed it out very dramatically. If you are fighting only on the defense, you're bound to lose, because there has to be some motion of some kind at different times, and in that case, every motion is back, and there's never any compensating motion forward. So whatever motion is made is always back, and the cumulative total of the motion eventually is sufficient to mean defeat. Fighting solely and purely on defense necessarily, inevitably leads to defeat, and must, by the very nature of things. It is fatal to be merely against losing ground, for then there is no way to go but back. We have to be for something. We must know what that something is, and we must believe it is worth a fight to obtain. Reduced to its simplest and broadest terms, that something is designated by the phrase that we started with: less government and more responsibility. For both less government and more responsibility bring increasing opportunities for human happiness. Now, due to the tremendous momentum given us by our hardworking, ambitious, and individualistic forefathers, our nation is still by far the most dynamic in the world in its productive processes and in its influences on the whole world's standard of living. We must again become, as we once were, equally dynamic in our spiritual influence, in our positive leadership and example, to provide a governmental environment in which individual man can make the most of his life in whatever way he, and not his government, wishes to use it. Now, there are many stages of welfarism, socialism, and collectivism in general, but communism is the ultimate state of them all, and they all lead inevitably in that direction. In this final stage, communism, you have a society in which class distinctions are greater than in any other, but where position in these classes is determined solely by demagogic political skill and ruthless cunning. You have a society in which all those traits which have helped to make man civilized and which our multiple faiths have classified as virtues are now discarded as vices, while exactly their opposites are glorified. You have a society in which every fault of government that we have been discussing for the last hour is held to be a benefit and a desirable part of the framework of life. But there is an exactly opposite direction. It leads towards a society in which brotherhood, real brotherhood, not the legislated kind, the phony kind, it leads towards a society in which brotherhood and kindliness and tolerance and honesty and self-reliance and the integrity of the human personality are considered virtues. A society which venerates those traits exactly because they have helped the human animal to achieve some degree of humanitarian civilization, because they are the common denominators of all of our great religions. This direction leads toward a governmental environment for human life founded on the basis of long experience with government, on experience which shows that we must have government, which shows government to be a necessary evil, but that it is a continuous brake on all progress and the ultimate enemy of all freedom. This is the forward direction, the upward direction, and Americanism, I hope, shall become its name. Now there, ladies and gentlemen, is our argument. That part of it which applies as I think it should be used in the political field, primarily for political purposes. To make it heard by and really understood by enough millions of Americans is a colossal undertaking. But who says it cannot be done? For who has really tried? Stop and ask yourselves that. We have all been fiddling around with halfway measures, with compromise measures, with delaying actions, instead of getting down to fundamental principles, standing on them with firmness, and remembering that future history is always determined by minorities who really know what they want. The whole New Deal march towards state socialism has been carried through and advanced to its present stage by a determined minority. We can bring about the necessary reversal of this trend if we, as a minority for what is right, stand as firm, work as hard, and give to the principles in which we believe the same dedication as has the sophomoric minority of so-called liberals which brought us to our present crisis. The question is not really the one we started with, whether we can expunge this disease of collectivism and make America strong and healthy and a true example for all the world again, but whether we think it is worth the Herculean effort, the sacrifice and dedication that would be required. I think it is and would be worth it, and I'm hoping you think so too. Begin with an invocation by Dr. Wilkinson.
Our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And because it is thy will, help us in our deliberations today to understand and forever remember that this land was ordained by thee as a land of liberty, that its constitution was divinely inspired, that it is our duty to support, defend, and preserve our liberties and our Constitution, and to live by the sweat of our own toil and not by the efforts of others. And just as there can be no collectivist entrance into thy eternal kingdom, so there can be no enduring collectivist salvation for thy children on this earth. We therefore pray at this time for a special blessing, that we, and especially Robert Welch and the leaders of this society, may have the inspiration, wisdom, courage, faith, and strength to chart a course that will lead our fellow citizens out of their present wilderness of confusion, doubt, civil disobedience, aggrandizement of the property of others, confiscatory and oppressive taxation, capricious, and arbitrary regulations, lack of faith, lack of national integrity, pagan worship of the false gods of mammon and government, which will lead us only into slavery, back again into the promised land of individual responsibility, self-respect, honor, integrity, love of liberty, and all the other enduring attributes of our Christian Judea civilization. These special blessings, our Father, we beseech thee in the name of Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen.
We are going to be doing some talking off and on directly about the John Birch Society. This is both inevitable and desirable for a number of reasons, including the fact that the society and its work is a part of the total picture. But I do want to explain, for the very reason that we shall be talking about it quite a bit off and on, that this is not in any way a recruiting meeting of the society. So I hope that our guests here, who are not members, will realize that in explaining about the society, explaining many matters about it, its structure, its purposes, its methods, that we are not making any pitch, if I may use a slang word, for membership. Don't misunderstand me. We always welcome qualified members, and we love to have members of great influence and good standing. We like to have members from any walk of life and any area if they are of good conscience, humane outlook, and religious ideals, if they are qualified. Being anti-communist is not itself sufficient qualification for membership in the John Birch Society. Because of our long-range purposes, because of all that we're trying to do, we must have associated with us people who, to repeat, are of goodwill, humane consciences, and religious ideals. So I wouldn't want anybody to think from what I'm saying that we don't want anybody to join. But I do want to make clear that we are not, in anything we do at this meeting, trying to urge anybody to join the society. We have a number of guests here that we are very glad to have, many of whom are themselves working in many ways in the same direction. They're toilers in the same vineyard that we are, and we hope that one result of this meeting can be perhaps some closer collaboration, mutual support, greater understanding among us all that will be helpful in the separate actions of each individual and of each group, and helpful to the total purposes of all of us. Now, we are going to go into the 6th section of this presentation, which is the positive approach to the questions of morality, integrity, and purpose. But before we do that, another matter. We began with the scoreboard showing the present level of communist advance. Then we looked at the two underlying trends, the progress of the disease of collectivism and the loss of real faith, which in the long run could be more fatal than the onslaught of the communist conspiracy. Then we began another look at the same things with remedial action in mind rather than diagnosis. We outlined some needed steps for facing up to the communist threat, while emphasizing the falsehood of Khrushchev's claim that communism was the wave of the future. We tried to make clear from the historical record that, in fact, and I'm going to use a rather indelicate figure of speech, but it's the only way I know to put it straightforward enough. We tried to make clear from the historical record that, in fact, communism today is simply a huge dirty boil on the body of mankind. like any such boil, it is painful. It is seeping poison all through the system. It could become dangerous, and it badly needs to be lanced and drained so that the scars can clear away and the whole body can become clean and healthy again. I'd like to have you keep in mind whenever you hear some liberal saying, well, we can't help it, it's inevitable, communism is the wave of the future. Nothing could be more false. As I say, I repeat, it's just a huge dirty boil on the body of mankind. Then we took a look at the huge task, but still a possible and worthwhile task, of stopping and expunging the cancer of collectivism, which has so prematurely attacked and weakened our national organism. At this time, we are going to continue this retracing of our steps, and we shall soon be dealing with the problem of morality in the study of how to restore the American body politic to good health, renewed strength, and as much promise for the future as is possible in view of the damage already done. But that brings me to a question concerning our structure, which should be cleared up in any meeting of this kind before we leave the discussion of these last two subjects, the threat of communism and the disease of collectivism. The answer to this question is one which I approach with great humility and considerable embarrassment, despite all of the encouragement of the past 6.5 years, but with no misgivings as to its necessity. For we simply are not going to be able to save our country from either the immediate threat of communism or the long-range threat of socialism by organizational leadership. Our only possible chance is dynamic personal leadership. Let me begin with an illustration of the difference which also supports the argument. In 1952, I disagreed with Bob Taft on at least 3 of his 10 most important political principles, especially with regard to federal housing and United States government aid to Israel. I was diametrically opposed to policies he advocated. Yet I made 25 radio speeches for Taft in the primary campaign on my own time and my own money. Nor was this done at all on the let's take the lesser of two evils theory. I was wholeheartedly and enthusiastically for Taft for the nomination and the presidency because I trusted him and he was going generally in my direction. The fact that he did not see 2 or 3 issues out of 10 the way I saw them did not dampen the energy of my personal support for him in the slightest. But if and when I am a member of any organization, political or otherwise, and there is disagreement on the part of any sizable percentage of the membership as to 3 out of 10 of the organization's policies or planks, a splintering of the organization into 2 groups is almost inevitable. In eastern Massachusetts, some years ago, there was quite a live and energetic outfit of some 700 members called the Friends of Senator McCarthy. I saw another organization called American Patriots splinter off from the original one and then resplinter into a larger and smaller group, while the remnant of the first organization went to pieces. And then the remnant of the other one went to pieces, and they all completely disappeared. There's no trace of the organization today. But if McCarthy was still alive, and if all the members of the organization had to agree on was support of a personal leader, there would probably be 2,000 working members of that organization today, despite exactly the same basic disagreements over various principles between them. When Frank Lausche, running as a Democrat, was elected governor of Ohio the last time, there must have been hundreds of thousands of Ohio Democrats who voted for him despite their vigorous disagreement with him over his support of Taft and of the Taft-Hartley Act. I don't know how many of you remember that in his last campaign for the governorship of Ohio, as a Democrat, and in a highly industrialized state, Frank Lausche came out openly, courageously, and strongly, not only for the Taft-Hartley Act, but for Bob Taft for the Senate. But if the Democratic Party of Ohio, an organization, had tried to take a position in support of the Taft-Hartley Act, it would have split the party wide open and have made it practically useless in the campaign. Personal leadership holds together a following in a way that organizational leadership never can. And maybe I may be forgiven for pointing out that it has been a tremendous help to us in keeping the society from being torn to pieces on many occasions over the past few years. People with all kinds of disagreements within it over all kinds of matters and being misled by criticisms, especially from our fellow conservatives, by some of the smears and falsehoods of our collectivist enemies, have still gone right along and stayed with the society because there was this unifying personal loyalty which they could go along with without thereby sacrificing or compromising their particular beliefs with regard to various matters and agenda items. This being true, let's look briefly at the possibility, the advantages and the disadvantages. May I say here from this point, because it's simpler, I'm just going to repeat what was said at the founding meeting of the Society in 1958. And ask you to put your minds back to 58, because all I'd have to do is confuse it a bit by trying to change it. So we said then, or I did, let's look briefly at the possibility, the advantages and the disadvantages of finding this desperately needed leader in the political field. And the easiest way to do this is to conduct the discussion around some individual from the very start. Now, the one man, I'm going to remind you 2 or 3 times, this is in December 1958 when I was saying this. Now, the one man who comes nearest to measuring up to all the needs and qualifications whom we can see on the political horizon at the present time is Barry Goldwater. I know Barry fairly well. He is a great American. As I foresaw in 1957 how the Rutherite left would concentrate national strength and resources on the Arizona campaign, and how important money from outside Arizona would be towards enabling Goldwater to meet the attack adequately, I took it on myself to become a one-man finance committee for him in Massachusetts. I raised around $2,000 in my state and sent it on to him early in 1958. Because earliness is always important in a political campaign, so far as the money is concerned. Now, $2,000 is not much, but Massachusetts is a long way from Arizona, especially when interest in just one senatorial campaign, the election of one senator, not too well known at that particular time, is what was involved. Also, the so-called upper crust of eastern Massachusetts consists of probably the most provincially and smugly ignorant people of what is really happening today of any similar group in the United States. And there are very sound historical reasons for that, quite convincing if you look into them. But at any rate, through the efforts of a lot of other people in other states who either had or were given the same idea, Barry had enough money and he had it early enough to put on a bang-up professional campaign. One that was successful for a Republican in a strongly Democratic state. I think the registration was about 2.5 to 1 in favor of the Democrats in Arizona that year. He was able to win this election against everything Walter Reuther could throw at him. Barry Goldwater has political know-how and the painstaking genius to use that know-how with regard to infinite details. He's a superb political organizer and inspires deep and lasting loyalty. He is absolutely sound in his Americanism, has the political and moral courage to stand by his Americanist principles, and in my opinion can be trusted to stand by them until hell freezes over. I'd love to see him President of the United States, and maybe someday we shall. This is 1958. But does anybody in this room think there is any slightest chance of Barry Goldwater supplying the dynamic overall leadership needed to save this country for anybody to be president of? If so, I think he or she is still not fully aware of the nature and totality of the forces at work. For Goldwater, by the very circumstances of his political success, present prestige, and the expectations of his supporters, will inevitably think and move in terms of political warfare, even if he personally should reach the point in the understanding of wanting to consider political action as just a part, no matter how important, of much broader overall action. How much chance do you think there is that his friends and supporters would let him step out of the strictly political role in which he has been so successful? How much chance is there that they would let him build and utilize forceful leadership on all of the other fronts besides the political one where we must fight the communists? How many of the steps which we have been discussing at this meeting, and which I am sure must be taken if we are to have any chance at all, do you think you could count on Barry Goldwater's leadership to bring about, no matter how much he himself might be willing, no matter how much he was beseeched, and no matter how much he himself might come to feel inclined to do so? Or let's go at it another way. Suppose you feel that the political factor in the equation is so important that it overweighs all of the others, and that if we could get a man like Barry Goldwater nominated and elected president by 1960, or even maybe by 1964, that the power of the presidency in the hands of such a man would be enough to save our country. Suppose you do feel that. Do you think that by strictly political means, and without the help of all of the other efforts on all of the other fronts, there would be the slightest chance of bringing this about? That with the present shattered condition of the Republican Party and the grip of the leftists inside both parties on various pieces of those parties, there's going to be any slightest chance of getting a solid, courageous, uncompromising Americanist nominated by either party, unless there are huge, compelling forces at work outside of the parties which are not affected by the ubiquitous opportunism inside the parties. If anybody in this room believes that with the slowing down of the rapidly rising communist influence left to the organizations in the field, and with the restoring of republicanism in the Republican Party left to the politicians, there is the slightest chance of our having anything but a left-wing president in 1961 or in 1965, then I would be greatly surprised. We've been counting on that kind of salvation and hence going steadily down the drain for 20 years. Or, more for the other illustrative points that will arise than for any hope offered by the prospect, let's look at Richard Nixon, and in this connection. Nixon is an extremely smart man. He is one of the ablest, shrewdest, most disingenuous, and slipperiest politicians that ever showed up on the American scene. Again, I repeat, this is 1958 when I was saying this. He can sit in Washington one night and convince some of the most modern Republicans that he is the best ball carrier they have, and spend 4 hours in the Waldorf Towers the next day convincing MacArthur and Herbert Hoover that he is their man. He can use the tremendously overrated and overpublicized, but actually highly cautious part he played in the Alger Hiss exposure to hang on to the hopeful loyalty of the vigorous anti-communists at the very time when he is insinuating himself into the good graces of the left by quietly knifing McCarthy. Nixon could pose as a conservative Republican congressman and yet be, as he was, right at the time when he's running for the Senate and being elected to the Senate as this incredibly conservative anti-communist, he was one of the original founders in 1950 of Republican Advance. Now, Republican Advance was intended to be not only the Republican parallel to, not the opposition to, but the Republican parallel to, the Republican teammate of Americans for Democratic Action, and to help to steer the Republican Party down exactly the same path that the ADA was steering and trying to steer the Democratic Party. But they even had interlocking left-wingers who were members of both groups to be sure that they were kept down the same straight line. And two of the founders of Republican Advance were Richard Nixon and Christian Herter. Nixon can claim still to be vigorously anti-communist, yet when he has a chance as vice president to break the tie and cast the decisive vote for H.R. 3 to reestablish some chance of prosecution of subversives actually advocating violent overthrow of our government, what happens? All he had to do was cast his vote. It was one for the anti-communist conservative side. Instead, he moves heaven and earth to have Wallace Bennett found and pressured into voting against H.R. 3, which Nixon himself didn't dare do and go on record as doing, thus defeating the measure so that the vice president would not have to vote at all. What good would such a man be to us, even as president, unless outside forces and accomplishments made it opportunistic and expedient for him to ride an anti-communist wave which those outside forces had created? As for being a leader, the sad truth, hard for many hopeful and wishful conservative Republicans to realize, is that Richard Nixon, a most engaging personality and clever politician, has never been a leader in connection with any event or development or at any stage in his career. He has been a rider of waves, so far as public support was concerned, without caring whether the particular wave at any given time was moving left or right. And he has been a manipulator of uncanny skill behind the scenes. I will ask you before the next sentence to remember that this was originally in 1958 given to an all-male audience. There were 11 men, no ladies. Because my next sentence is, Nixon always brings to my mind the old gag that a wife is a person who helps you to get over all the troubles you wouldn't have had if you hadn't got married. Or the somewhat more elegant version that diplomats help us to solve our problems that never would have arisen if there had not been any diplomats. But for the dirtiest deal in American political history, participated in, if not actually engineered, by Richard Nixon, in order to make himself vice president and to put Warren on the Supreme Court as part of that deal, Taft would have been nominated at Chicago in 1952. It is almost certain that Taft would then have been elected president by a far greater plurality than was Eisenhower, that a grand rout of the communists in our government and in our midst would have been started, that McCarthy would be alive today, and that we wouldn't even be in this mess that we are supposed to look to Nixon to lead us out of. And in appraising Richard Nixon's character, nobody should overlook the vicious undercover knifing of Bill Nolan by Nixon's men in California in the campaign just finished, fall of '58. And this is not surmise, gentlemen, but definite fact, observed at first hand by stalwart Republicans in California, some of whom were personal friends of Nixon and at first just could not believe what they were seeing. They came to believe it all right, for Nixon was determined to get rid of Nolan once and for all and at any cost as a possible contender for control of the California delegation and for the nomination in 1960. This despite the fact that from the day Nixon landed in Washington as a freshman congressman, nobody had been nicer to him or helped him in more ways than the well-loved senator from his own state, Bill Nolan. Then I said, now please do not project my remarks about Nixon beyond their intended purpose. He may be the best bet we have for the Republican standard-bearer in 1960 who has any chance of getting the nomination. He would be far better than Nelson Rockefeller. For while I think Nixon would ride any wave to the right or left that seemed likely to carry him farthest, I don't think Nixon would be committed to personally helping to make the wave go left, as I think Nelson Rockefeller would be. I think Nixon could become a very patriotic anti-communist if we could create circumstances in which it would be smart politics to be one. Whereas I think Nelson Rockefeller would fight for further movement towards the internationalist left under any and all circumstances. I think Nelson Rockefeller is definitely committed to trying to make the United States a part of a one-world socialist government, while I don't think Nixon is committed to anything other than the career of Richard Nixon. In that, he is neither better nor worse than most other politicians, merely smarter. I can foresee possibilities where every one of us would work for him and vote for him in 1960, despite what I have said, as if, for instance, he were the Republican candidate against Jack Kennedy on the Democratic ticket. I have made these remarks primarily in order to emphasize the wisdom of the old advice: put not your faith in politicians. We shall have to use politicians, support politicians, create politicians, and help the best ones we can find to get elected. I am thoroughly convinced, however, that we cannot count on politicians, political leadership, nor even political action, except as a part of something much deeper and broader to save us. Now, I didn't always feel that way, and I still think that up to the time the nomination was stolen from Bob Taft in 1952, it was still possible to have saved our country from the immediate communist danger anyway, primarily by political action. And up until the end of 1957, I was still giving some thought to starting some quiet but strong non-political organizing for political purposes right in Massachusetts, with a view to either capturing or trying to capture the Republican nomination for the Senate from Saltonstall in 1960, or running as an independent as circumstances might then indicate. The further idea was to try to go to the United States Senate by supreme effort to that end, and there make such contribution as one outspoken senator could make towards stemming the tide. But my study of the whole picture convinced me more and more that, one, no one outspoken senator, nor a dozen outspoken senators, and no amount of the ephemeral political support they might muster could possibly save our country unless there was, encompassing them and their efforts and support, this far larger and broader movement to which I keep referring. That there was not going to be any such movement without the dynamic overall personal leadership to which I have also been referring. And three, that with all of my own shortcomings, there wasn't anybody else on the horizon willing to give their whole lives to the job with the determination and dedication I would put into it if I didn't. What really moved me to cross this Rubicon, however, the consideration which more than any other gradually brought me the necessary measure of courage and determination for so staggering an undertaking, was another result of many years of study of not only the present but the past. This is the conviction that even warding off communist slavery and reversing the socialist trend is only half of the battle. We can never win even that half unless both leadership and following have a positive dream which is more important as a hope than the negative nightmare is as a fear. Unless the promise of what we can build supplies more motivation than the terror of what we must destroy. And unless this faith in the future is based on a deeper faith in eternal truths. Now, the nature of these truths and the tenets of this faith, which I hope and believe every man and woman in this room can accept and approve, I'm coming to in just a very short while. Now, we're going into the sixth of these 6 divisions, and I want to begin it by quoting to you the first 3 stanzas of O'Shaughnessy's great ode, The Music Makers. We are the music makers, and we are the dreamers of dreams, wandering by lone sea breakers and sitting by desolate streams, world losers and world forsakers, on whom the pale moon gleams. Yet we are the movers and shakers of the world forever, it seems. With wonderful deathless ditties we build up the world's great cities, and out of a fabulous story we fashion an empire's glory. One man with a dream at pleasure shall go forth and conquer a crown, and 3 with a new song's measure can trample an empire down. We, in the ages lying in the buried past of the earth, built Nineveh with our sighing, and Babel itself with our mirth, and overthrew them with prophesying to the old of the new world's worth. For each age is a dream that is dying, or one that is coming to birth. Now, the whole poem, including the many stanzas I did not read, seems to me an impressive tribute to the power of imagination to design and direct the course of history. But I really read that much of it simply to put in their proper setting just these two lines. For each age is a dream that is dying, or one that is coming to birth. For the last 50 years, ladies and gentlemen, our age has been a dream that was dying. I am proposing that we turn our faces forward instead of backward, begin to make even our defensive actions fit into a constructive design, and do our part to usher in a new age that is coming to birth. Now, I did not expect the New York Times to begin announcing excitedly in January 1959 that obviously the world had started on a new era in Indianapolis in December. But if every person here should leave feeling that he or she had been at the beginning of a new chapter in history, it would be true. It would be true no matter how long the historians might take to find it out. Now, the basic reason why the old age is dying is that the faith which was the core of its strength no longer commands the unquestioning loyalty of enough of its devotees. For the dream of any nation or any people must depend on faith. The foundation of our new dream must be faith, or it will never come to pass. Where is this faith, and what is this faith? So true that neither our hearts nor our reasons can deny it, so broad that it takes in without violation the faith of our fathers, and so deep that it can inspire martyrdom at need. As to where, it is right in front of us. And as to what, it is exactly what we in this room already and actually believe. To try to make this clear, in the only convincing way I know, I'm going to do what no man, except perhaps ministers whose life is given to it, what no man ordinarily likes to do. I'm going to try to tell you what I really believe in some of the areas that are considered parts of a man's religion. For Emerson said, "It is the outlook of genius to feel that what is true of yourself is also true of all mankind." Making no claim to genius, I'll still try to imitate one for this occasion. Now, first let me repeat here for the devout Catholics and fundamentalist Protestants, who are among my best friends and certainly among our strongest supporters, that it is no part of my purpose to disturb their beliefs in the slightest, or the beliefs of any man or woman who really does have a religious faith instead of just the shell of one. What I am concerned about, what we must all be vitally concerned about today as the very essence of our problem, is morality, integrity, and purpose. That morality must be based on a bedrock of faith. For those who already have such a bedrock of faith and stand on it and abide by it, I can offer nothing, and I would certainly take nothing away. But for those who are no longer sure exactly where they do stand, on what rocks or how firmly, I want to try to show them that all of these bedrocks together constitute a foundation with room and strength for us all. For unless we willingly anchor our moral judgments to eternal truths, we become just chaff, blown all ways before the winds of confusion. So let me, however reluctantly, point to some of the rocks of my own faith, not for the devout and the fundamentalists who do not need it, but for others whom possibly I may help. The keystone to my own religious beliefs, at least when you get completely away from direct, immediate dogma and creed, which we're not going to go into, the keystone to my own religious belief, I think, was best delineated by Tennyson in just one great line. For I doubt not through the ages one increasing purpose runs. Neither Tennyson nor any other sane man could doubt this fact, as we shall emphasize presently. But first let us ask whose purpose, God's or man's? But if man has had one increasing purpose through the ages, from what source did it come? And who decided what the direction of that purpose was to be? The fundamentalist Christian says immediately that a divine being created man with this purpose predetermined. And I agree. Nor do I wish to disturb his understanding of how God created man. I personally think that, at the present level of our knowledge, we must conceive of this divine being having done so by creating Milky Ways and astronomical universes with laws and purposes which caused planets like our Earth to develop, and by creating evolutionary forces which both produced man and endowed him with purpose greater than his individual self. I think that if this Creator allows man to continue to grow and his purpose to continue to increase, our knowledge will reach a level in another few thousand years where even this concept will seem far too detailed against the broader and larger forces we can then glimpse, that even this present concept will seem to have viewed the Creator as far too close, too understandable, and too provincial a power against the remoteness, majesty, and omnipotence then conceivable. Just as the details of man's creation, as our forefathers understood the book of Genesis, seem to some of us now to have obscured a concept of incredible grandeur by man's egocentric insistence on bringing God down almost to his own size. But our fundamentalist ancestors believed that God created man and God is great. We must agree completely. We merely feel today that God is infinitely greater than those ancestors were yet allowed to see. When we first start to study mathematics, the childish mind finally grasps that such large numbers as 1,000 times 1,000 do not make any dent on the measure of infinity. But it is hard for the child to realize that neither does a billion to the billionth power put him one whit nearer to the edges of infinity than before he started. An adult man finds the same difficulty with his religious concepts. It is hard for man to realize that the infinite still remains infinite, untouched in its remoteness and unreduced in its infinity by man's most ambitious approaches, or that all of man's increasing knowledge leaves the unknowable just as completely unknowable as before. But I think that, being allowed now to grasp this truth, we should cease to quarrel and disagree over how close we are to God. For we are using a term which, in a literal context or objectively, has no meaning. We can then each put the God we worship as close to ourselves subjectively as our own faith and understanding dictate, and agreeing that a Creator greater than ourselves has visibly endowed us with purpose. I go back and say that there is a purpose in man beyond anything called for by his individual needs and far greater than his personal desires, can be denied only by the most depraved maniac or the most ignorant fool. One of the best summarizations of the force and beauty and eternal quality of that purpose is contained in William Herbert Carruth's Each in His Own Tongue, which I should like to recall to your minds. And ladies and gentlemen, lest some of you think there is anything blasphemous or even too secular in my repeated reference to the poets in this discussion, let me point out to you that the men who wrote many of the books of the Old Testament and those who wrote most of the books of the New Testament were the poetic spirits of their respective ages. Theirs were the minds on which their contemporaries and successors depended to interpret and phrase man's most profound thoughts, most permanent beliefs, and deepest faith. I have been a lover of poetry all of my life, and I don't mean the kind of junk that you see in most of the magazines today, but of real poetry. And I don't know of any line in English, in the greatest of English poetry, that is any better poetry than whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. And you can find in St. Paul's letters line after line of truly great poetry. So I just want to repeat that theirs were the minds, the men who wrote the books of our New Testament. Theirs were the minds on which their contemporaries and successors depended to interpret and phrase man's most profound thoughts, most permanent beliefs, and deepest faith. Those same interpretations and recordings and expressions of man's developing experiences, beliefs, and faith do not come to us today as further books added to our Bible, but they are being given to us with greater and easier understanding than we might otherwise achieve by the same kind of reverent and poetic minds. So here is Carruth's justly famous poem. A fire mist and a planet, a crystal and a cell, a jellyfish and a saurian, and caves where the cavemen dwell. Then a sense of law and beauty, and a face turned from the clod. Some call it evolution, and others call it God. A haze on the far horizon, the infinite tender sky, the ripe rich tint of the cornfields and the wild geese sailing high, and all over upland and lowland the charm of the goldenrod. Some of us call it autumn, and others call it God. Like tides on a crescent sea beach, when the moon is new and thin, into our hearts high yearnings come welling and surging in, come from the mystic ocean whose rim no foot has trod. Some of us call it longing, and others call it God. A picket frozen on duty, a mother starved for her brood, Socrates drinking the hemlock, and Jesus on the rood, and millions who, humble and nameless, the straight, hard pathway plod. Some call it consecration, and others call it God. Now, who can read that, realize the incontrovertible and wonderful truth of the story of man's purpose at work, which the poet tells, and fail to feel reverently bound to serve that same purpose faithfully and well? Now, this brings me to the second keystone, if any such contradictory figure of speech is allowed, in my own personal belief. It is the answer to the question, what is that purpose? And this, too, has been summarized by yet another poet, Harry Kemp, in just one brilliant line. Thou hast put an upward reach in the heart of man. Thou hast put an upward reach in the heart of man. In fact, it seems to me that to make us truly religious, we do not need to know anything more about God, man, and man's relationship to God than is given by a reverent understanding of that line. Thou hast put an upward reach in the heart of man. And again, it makes no difference to me, and it is a subjective matter which should cause no disagreement between us, how each one feels that this upward reach has been inculcated into the heart of man. But the thoroughness with which it has been done is a majestic revelation. For look with me first at the common denominators of all of our great religions, that man shall not steal, which further means, of course, that man shall recognize and respect property rights, because unless there are property rights, there can be no stealing. There's nothing to steal unless something belongs to somebody. That man shall not steal is common to them all of our great religions. So is the injunction that man shall not murder nor harm his fellow man. So are the concepts of kindness and charity and restraint of appetites and industriousness and respect for age and experience and gratitude for favors received and an individual's responsibility for his own trespasses and the expectation of justice and faith in a happier future and obeisance to the laws and morals and temporal government of the time and age, and a reverence for a power of powers greater than man himself. And of course a dozen others, both general and specific, that I have not named. But ladies and gentlemen, please note, these are also exactly the characteristics with which evolutionary selection has gradually endowed man to enable him to rise out of an animal existence, haltingly but surely, towards a more humane civilization and a promise of a tremendously more wonderful future. In fact, the very word upward, as we use it here, can be taken to describe and define those traits which, found in some species and not found in others, caused those favored species to outstrip their rivals and to come upward through the evolutionary competition until one such species became civilized man. One philosopher will tell you that the possession of these upward traits in some species was purely an accident of nature. Another, that it was due to the plan of a divine being. To me, they are both saying the same thing. Let's take one or two very simple illustrations. Today, man finds a rose garden beautiful, and the view of clear running water so pleasurable that he builds countless fountains to make his landscapes charming. Originally, of course, the presence of flowers like the rose meant fertile soil, the kind of sunny climate in which birds and bees and man all thrived, and the absence of noxious jungle. So, of course, the rose was beautiful because of the association with it and what it meant. While clear running water originally meant that man had escaped from desert or jungle to an area to which he was far better adjusted for sustaining life and making it more pleasant. But do these facts from man's biological history make the rose or running water or man's love for both any less wonderful? The same thing is true with regard to those gradually acquired characteristics of his own animal nature and later human personality, which converted him from monkey to primate to barbarian, and then to a man so far civilized that the male proposes deferentially to the weaker female before he will even touch her in satisfaction of the second strongest impulse of his being. Does the fact that these characteristics, which together constitute the upward reach, were acquired by man or given to him through the mechanics of evolutionary competition, if they were, does this make them any less wonderful or reduce in the slightest our gratitude to a creator who provided that upward reach? Why do we have to feel that the best qualities of man were given to us full-blown by some more direct magic? Or how could any magic be greater than that so inadequately described here? More important than either question, what difference does it make, so far as our clear duty to use and strengthen all impulses of the upward reach is concerned? Not only are we a part of some mighty purpose beyond our full understanding, and not only do we have a clear duty to be true to that purpose to the greatest extent that we are allowed to grasp its workings and its direction, but all human experience shows that the total happiness of any generation and of its posterity is directly tied to the respect of that generation for the upward reach in man's nature. We have all the reason here that man can ask, divine or human or pragmatic, for keeping our consciences attuned to the emotions and impulses which increase man's upward reach, and for then obeying those consciences, obeying by commission as well as omission, to the utmost of our respective willpowers and abilities. Now let me assure you that, in my opinion, all of this brief adventure into theological philosophy does have direct bearing on even the most practical problems we are here to consider. And since I am hereby repeating participation in the first confessional of my life, and wearing my heart more openly on my sleeve than I had ever done before, let me go all the way and translate these basic motivations into the specific form in which their impact hammers away with a comforting persistence on my particular conscience. I first broke through the intellectually restricting bonds of the unusually narrow Southern Baptist fundamentalism in which I was raised more than 40 years ago. I pointed out that among the minutiae that began to bother me were such things as the chart on the wall that said the earth was created in the year 4004 BC specifically. I loved everything about the fundamentalist Southern Baptist faith in which I was raised except some of these specific details of its dogma. As a result of its teachings, its major teachings, I saw myself as the inheritor of all the labor and sacrifice that had gone before me by men who had used this God-given upward reach. They had used it to provide the moral codes, the humane traditions, the accumulation of knowledge, and the material comforts to make me so fortunate an heir of so many ages, to whatever extent I was equal to my inheritance. I felt myself bound by a gentleman's code, which is just another way of expressing continuing human brotherhood or loyalty, to live up to the standards and carry on the ideals of men who had died hundreds and even thousands of years before I was born. The substance of my conscience, as I believe it is really the substance of the conscience of every man and woman in this room, was gratitude and a corresponding sense of responsibility. Gratitude, if you will let me paraphrase Henley's line without the slightest implication of blasphemy, gratitude to whatever God there was, and gratitude to all of the noble men of the past for the life and the environment for that life which were given to me, and responsibility to God and man to be worthy as far as I was able of the human race at its best. And ladies and gentlemen, what firmer foundation can we possibly need for the faith on which to build our new age and with which to inaugurate the dream that is coming to birth? Wherever we turn in looking at whatever blessings we have for the present and hopes for the future, we find a need for gratitude that makes the acceptance of responsibility a duty and a source of inward happiness. Consider, for instance, and for an instant, the blessing of freedom. Kipling once wrote truly, "All we know of freedom, all we need to know, this our fathers won for us long and long ago." Are we, as Lowell put it, going to be traitors to our sires and lose that freedom for our children and their children? Macaulay had Horatius say, "And how can man die better than facing fearful odds for the ashes of his fathers and the temples of his gods?" And so we ask ourselves in simple sincerity, if it becomes necessary, just how can man die better? Especially if in doing so he appreciably reduces the odds faced by his compatriots in their fight against the overwhelming forces of evil threatening us today. But our reason for gratitude and corresponding responsibility extends to every field and corner of the civilization we now enjoy, perhaps for so short a time longer. It is worthwhile remembering now and then men like Hugh Latimer. In 1555, when he and his friend Ridley were being burned at the stake for heresy, and all he had to do to save his life was to say the proper words of recantation, his veneration for spiritual freedom and truth caused him to say instead, "Be of good comfort, Master Ridley, and play the man. We shall this day light such a candle by God's grace in England as I trust shall never be put out." There are thousands of men like him to whose veneration for the upward reach in the heart of man we owe the very fact that we can sit in this room today and discuss religious matters without fear. But it is not even to the martyrs, perhaps, that we owe the most. There have been missionaries and scholars, the Catholic monks of the Middle Ages, poets and philosophers, builders and explorers, statesmen and scientists throughout centuries receding into the unknown past, who have toiled and dreamed and sacrificed and died, that you and I might have the comforts and freedoms and hopes that we enjoy now in so fair and happy a land. One of the worst and most sadly disturbing traits of many of our young people today is that they take their inheritance for granted and have no thought of its cost. This is a vital part of the moral breakdown that is endangering our civilization. It shows how basic and necessary a component of faith is man's feeling of continuity and gratitude. Let us, with a faith for the future based on this very principle of gratitude to God and man, lived up to by ourselves and made a living and articulate faith for others by both example and teaching, let us try to bring many of these young people who are now at loose ends because of their lack of any faith back into the conscious current of man's increasing purpose. For a code of honor and an ennobling sense of responsibility are themselves gifts to the human soul which have been won by its upward reach. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I've tried to give you freely and frankly the substance of at least some of my religious beliefs. And without any claim to goodness, wisdom, or originality, I've tried in far too short a time for so huge a subject to indicate to you the elements of a faith which I still hope and believe is shared by all of you no matter how differently you might have explained or expressed it. It is a faith for which I have earnestly hoped that it might encompass the individual beliefs of most men of goodwill, that it might refill our ancient founts of inspiration, and that it would become a basis and a beginning of renewed dedication to a dream of man's future. And before we completely leave this particular subject, I want to go back. You weren't aware of it, but at one point when I was discussing the negative side of this more or less philosophical, religious question, that I paused and hesitated quite a bit. And I want to go back and read the place over which I was hesitating. I was trying to decide whether to go into certain matters right then or not. The passage I want to read to you, and I was talking about that, I said, now I know that there are still millions of devout Catholics, fundamentalist Protestants, and faithful Jews in this country who still believe unquestioningly in the divine truths and powers which their Bibles reveal to them, and whose conduct and relations with their fellow men are guided strictly by the precepts of their religious faith, or who at least feel that they have sinned whenever they have transgressed such precepts as understood by their consciences. I have hundreds of good friends in those categories, including some in this room. Then I said this: let all of us thank whatever God we severally worship that there is so large a remnant of the really true believers still left. The point I hesitated over as to whether to bring out then, I want to make now, is how incredibly important to the communist, how dangerous to their aims is the true believer. And you can get some idea of that from one incident. There have been just 2 books that during the 8 years were given the full prestige of the presidency of the United States, put behind them. One was one we talked about, Harry Overstreet's What We Must Know About Communism. The other book, one of the only 2, was Eric Hofer's The True Believer, in which President Eisenhower praised, which he told about, saying that it was a great book, that he wished everybody could read it. I would seriously doubt he'd ever read a page of it, but that doesn't matter. He told everybody should read it. Eric Hofer's The True Believer. Ladies and gentlemen, this was a very clever and vicious volume of ridicule against faith of any kind or in anything. Its theme was that anybody who believed in any doctrine, it's put very cleverly, on a very high level, very academically, but its theme was that anybody who believed in any doctrine or principle or purpose enough to dedicate effort to it or make sacrifices for it was simply a childish jackass who ought to grow up and learn how silly was his attitude, or he ought to be laughed at if he didn't. In other words, the whole idea was just to make fun of anybody who believed that anything was worthwhile, really dedicating themselves to it or making sacrifices for it. And this, very important to the communists, to put over that idea, to make fun of the true believer of any kind in anything. Now, there were 2 passages here, right in this one short paragraph, about which I wanted to comment. Let me go back. Let us all thank whatever God we severally worship that there is so large a remnant of the really true believers still left. We honor them. We need their steadying adherence to the rock of reverence and their aspiration of unwavering obedience to ancient and divine commandments. We desperately need their unshakable confidence in absolutes, in eternal principles and truths, in a world of increasing relativity and transitoriness in all things. Ladies and gentlemen, the thing which most amazes the student of the conspiracy as he goes on and on is how incredibly extensive, far-reaching, long-planned, and comprehensive have been the communist designs. Breaking down a belief in absolutes, convincing men that everything was relative, has been of extreme importance to them. We're going to come back in connection with that from another side later. But they have had to break down any belief that there were absolute truths, absolute principles, and they carry this idea of relativity even further. They never want precise lines of any kind. They don't want moral lines, physical lines, legal lines. They want everything confused so that you can't tell where the line is. They just absolutely try to get rid of all lines of demarcation, everything. And they try to make everything relative, nothing absolute. Ladies and gentlemen, the one place of absolutes in all human knowledge, of course, is mathematics. Edna St. Vincent Millay said, Euclid alone has looked on beauty bare, meaning the beauty there does not depend on our value judgments or the eye of the observer or his particular fondness for one thing or another. This is beauty in itself, beauty bare. This is absolute. Mathematics never depends on value judgments or the subjective view of the viewer. It is rigidly absolute. Mathematics has been the last sanctuary of the human mind in finding absolutes when everything else around it became relative. So the communists set out to destroy that. They couldn't destroy it, but to convince men that it was destroyed. And there you have the explanation of Einstein. Albert Einstein, of course, was a communist first, a fiddler second, and a mathematician third, if he was a mathematician at all. Einstein's mathematics, in my opinion, I'm not qualified, although higher mathematics in the pure arithmetic side, field of numbers, it's been one of my hobbies I haven't had time for years. I don't, and I have done some work in the theory of numbers, I don't claim to know enough mathematics to begin to express this opinion on my own. But one of the men invited to the original Indianapolis meeting at which the John Birch Society was founded was Bela Hubbard. He'd had 2 heart attacks, which I didn't know, and he couldn't come to the meeting, and he died shortly after from another heart attack. His name may be known to some of you. He wrote some excellent sociological books, although he was primarily a scientist, a geologist, all over the world for 30 years. Bela Hubbard, when he died, was half through a book to prove the absolute phoniness of Einstein's mathematics. And Hubbard was, I believe, qualified to do so. Einstein's mathematics makes you think exactly of the old fable of the emperor's clothes. You've always been told, there's only a dozen men in the world could understand Einstein's mathematics. So nobody wanted to admit, if he was a top-flight mathematician, that he wasn't one of the dozen. You remember the story of the emperor's clothes? The emperor had ordered some very, very nice raiment, the finest ever made. And when he goes, finally, he's told that it's ready, and he goes to see the raiment, and the tailor and his assistants go through all these motions of describing this beautiful garment and the beautiful cut. They insist on taking the emperor's clothes off and putting this on him. And they just rave over it. The emperor can't quite understand it, but he didn't want to admit that he doesn't see it and doesn't know about it. So anyway, he then finally goes into the hall of the courtiers who are waiting to see the emperor come out with his new raiment, the finest raiment ever was. And there's a couple of the courtiers have been with him that are all already have swallowed all of this, and they go out and they're raving about it. And each one wants to show how much smarter than he is, and see the beautiful texture of the cloth. Notice the sheen, and notice the wonderful cut at the shoulders, and all of this. And so the whole hall of courtiers rave about the emperor's clothes, till finally some child would have to be there. Says, "What's the matter? The emperor's naked. He didn't have any clothes on." But you've had identically the same thing applied to Einstein's mathematics. As I said, nobody wanted to admit that they didn't understand it, because that made them out to be really not that good. For the whole thing has been an effort to break down man's belief in mathematics, even as being absolute, and mathematical laws as absolute. Now you have to go back a little bit and realize who Einstein was. In this country, you never could possibly bring out the truth about him, like you couldn't bring it out about Frankfurter, because you got accused of something you weren't guilty of. If you did, you got racial arguments into it. They counted on that. They didn't belong there. But most people think that Einstein got out of Germany because of Hitler's horrible pogroms against the Jews. Einstein was run out of Germany for being a communist long before Hitler came anywhere near to power. When the first great worldwide communist front was founded, the League Against Imperialism in 1927,
founded in Brussels. This was the beginning of the worldwide play on this anti-colonialism idea. The League against the imperialist nations of Europe. You can be sure they had no concern about the imperialism of Russia, but the League against imperialism, I repeat, the first great worldwide communist front. The founders of that league were Romain Rolland of France, J. Nehru of India, who right after that, with his whole family, spent months in Russia, incidentally, J. Nehru of India, Eleanor Roosevelt's old friend, Mohammed Hatta of Indonesia, and Albert Einstein of Germany. They were the four founders of that front. Einstein was always an out-and-out communist and supporting communist causes in every way. But in my opinion, that's all I can give you. The whole Einstein theory, so-called, was a long-range, carefully designed out, looking far ahead plan to break down that last sanctuary of the human mind for absolutes, the last belief that there was anything really absolute. And this is why I paused over this sentence when I said we desperately need their unshakable confidence in absolutes, in eternal principles and truths, in a world of increasing relativity and transitoriness in all things, which the communists have tried to make it. And of course there are absolutes. 2 and 2 do make 4, at all times, in all places, all climes, under all conditions. And the law of gravity still works throughout the whole total universe.
In a question and answer period which followed, a seminar guest referred back to Mr. Welch's mention of J. Nehru's training in Russia and asked Mr. Welch to explain how this differed from Chiang Kai-shek's one-time association with communists, including his activities in Moscow. This was the response.
Sun Yat-sen began the Chinese Revolution in 1911. Sun Yat-sen was always a socialist, I think an honest, honorable one. Early began to be convinced of the tremendous ability and daring of the Russian communist, looked up to them from afar as being an industrial nation, which his wasn't. They weren't nearly as much as he thought. And by the time Borodin and Earl Browder and what was the German name? There were 3 of them, Borodin and Earl Browder, and a German whose name I can't even pull off, and yet it's a name that's fairly well known in German history. Not this man, but the name. By the time they got there in around 1922 or 3 to work, why, they succeeded in selling Chiang even more admiration for the Russians. There were several young men coming up as possible successors to Sun Yat-sen, although he was not expecting to pass away that early. And among them was Chiang Kai-shek, and Chiang was trying to get along with all of the others. Chiang went to Moscow to be indoctrinated, taught, shown by the communists, and of course from their point of view to be taken over and controlled and guided in about 1923. He stayed a few weeks. He came back and turned in a report to Sun Yat-sen. The report is still in the archives somewhere, can be found, in which, for political reasons or otherwise, he expressed considerable admiration for what the Russian communists had been able to do, supposedly in such quick order. But the final net conclusion of his paper and report was that it was nothing for China, and China should have nothing to do with the Soviets or the Soviet system. This is the thing that began the break between him and Borodin and Browder and the communists, who were expecting at that time to be able to take over Sun Yat-sen's government. Chiang went to the Whampoa Military Academy after that and did a tremendous job of building up Whampoa. All of this was happening in a very few years. Then Sun Yat-sen died, and the question was who would take over. Chiang had already made his break with Moscow. He'd never been sold. He never was a communist, never became one. He was, under Sun Yat-sen in the beginning, naturally inclined to look up to these revolutionaries because Sun Yat-sen was leading a revolutionary movement. But 1925 came and the battle for power began. And by 1927, it was coming to a head, and Chiang Kai-shek embarked on his northern expedition. Like Julius Caesar's, the die is cast when he crossed the Tiber. When Chiang embarked on his northern expedition, why, the die was cast. And of course, he made progress. He got to Hankow, conquered it, moved on.
He hadn't more than moved on in Hankow when the communists succeeded in persuading, using mob psychology, persuading the troops he had left in charge of Hankow to start murdering Europeans and Americans. And Chiang was horrified and heartbroken. The Chinese Revolution at this time was 16 years old. This was the first time that any American or European had ever had an arm scratched or a finger scratched in the Chinese Revolution. It was in Hankow in 1927. Chiang turned back, came back, brought enough force back with him to capture and take over the troops he'd left there, make a thorough investigation, run down everybody he could, and hang them all or execute them all. He was very thorough in doing it. Then left sufficient troops that he could depend on, in charge of men he could depend on in Hankow, and went on with his northern expedition, which, as you know, was successful and enabled him, in theory anyway, to unify China and take it over to make it the Republic of China, which is what he was after. Now, Chiang, in his early days with Sun Yat-sen, who was a socialist, always was, naturally had socialistic leanings. He thought of this as the great new modern way of running the economics of a country. And he didn't grow out of it easy. He became an anti-communist, and he fought them, but in all of the turmoil they were in, there wasn't too much chance for him to try to do too much about China's economy anyway, except establish some law and order and keep the system that had been there working as well as he could. And I would say that Chiang remained in his own mind basically a socialist until about the time that he took over Formosa, or a little before. But you must remember that Chiang always believed in a republican form of government. He was a believer in establishing the Republic of China as an honest, true republic. And twice in his career he hurt the total cause, his own cause and that of China very much, by resigning from his job. The last time was in 1949. It was disastrous to have somebody else run it in order to avoid any possibility of being a dictator or being considered as one. And of course, the whole opposition to communism went to pieces in a few months with Chiang out of the picture in 49, so he came back and took over again too late. But he was extremely anxious to make China a true republic. So much so that in Formosa, after he was there, he was scrupulously careful to observe republican forms. There used to be comments that when Chiang died, there'd be a fight for the succession between can you remember the general who was disgraced in 55, and there was a lot of intrigue that did it? There were three possible successors to Chiang. One was this general, and there was Chen Cheng, the vice president, and Chiang Ching-kuo. They tried to spread the rumor that if Chiang died, there'd be all this fight for power, and the Formosans would tell you, but they believed it anyway. There wouldn't even be any question. Chiang died, Chen Cheng would take over. He was the vice president, and that was it. And I think that would have happened. Now, as I say, he's gone too, so it's a different story. But Chiang did everything he could to preserve, build up a republican form of government. And in the course of doing so, he gradually became more conservative in his ideas of economics. He learned more about the American system as it really had been, instead of what Roosevelt's gang were pretending it was. By the time I even got to know him, he was no longer a socialist. He'd become a fairly good conservative businessman type. He gave me a letter in 1955 to take back to the board of directors of the National Association of Manufacturers, in which he expresses some good conservative views, not nearly as solid as Syngman Rhee's, who'd come all the way around, but still all right. And Chiang set out to follow the honest, true American pattern rather than all the New Deal version of it, although with an awful lot of the New Deal in it, naturally, in establishing the economy and the industry of Formosa. And he has done quite a good job in using free enterprise in Formosa today. Now, he's had a battle everywhere you turn. As you know, Sun Yat-sen married the eldest one of the Sung sisters, who is now Madame Sun Yat-sen. She became a communist way back under the influence of the communists in 1922, 3, and 4. She remained one. And, of course, she's elderly now. Sun Yat-sen was a lot older than she was. And she is still the goddess, at least unless there's been a change since the last I knew, in the last year or two. She's still the goddess of Sun Yat-sen University in Moscow, And she used to be, they'd keep her there, or send her there, or bring her there to receive traveling Chinese students for the impression it would make on them to have Madame Sun Yat-sen there when they went to this communist school in Moscow. And she's remained a communist, whereas Chiang divorced his first wife, and dropped her, is all they did in the Orient in those days, and married Mei Li Sung, the middle of the Sung sisters. So Madame Chiang, Mei Li Sung's older sister, is Madame Sun Yat-sen, the out-and-out communist. Madame Chiang herself, Mei Li Sung, was living in Japan when Chiang fell in love with her in 1927. It really was a love affair, although I guess there were some other advantages as well. And always advantage in falling in love with a rich girl with a powerful family, if you can. That's what I did. I mean, excuse me. Anyway, so he married Mei Li Sung, and her older sister is an out-and-out communist and always has been. And of course, the other sister married H.H. Kung. H.H. Kung, the last I knew, is living on Long Island, still is, a very wealthy man, and he doesn't have a principle in the book. He's for whatever makes money for and allows comfort for H.H. Kung. There's no question about that. And of course, one of the best-known brother of that family, the 3 girls and 3 boys, was T.V. Soong. And T.V. Soong is the son of the elder Soong, who made all this money for the family. And he was at one time finance minister for Chiang Kai-shek back in about 1938. Very able man, but he broke with him. He's too opportunistic, I think, basically. And of course, T.V. Soong is one of the richest men in the world. He's become very, very rich. And you never know. I don't know where he is, or where he stays, or where his headquarters are. I guess his headquarters is probably in New York today, or London. I don't know which. But he's been no help to Chiang for a long time. They've had problems. They had a reunion of the family in 1940, I think 1940, right along there, in Hong Kong, where they got the whole family together. They never tried again. It was not a happy reunion. It didn't work out too well. Then problems and plenty. But I think Madame Chiang, she's a very imperial character. But a lot of ability and a lot of drive. I think she's been very good. And Chiang Kai-shek, in my opinion, is very, very able.